Strava has just filed a lawsuit against Garmin, a massive sprawling lawsuit alleging that Garmin has violated patents in two core areas on their products, and this will impact both Strava users as well as Garmin users. So I'm going to dive into what this means. I'm going to go into the lawsuit, whether or not some of these claims have any merit, because of course you can sue anyone for anything in the United States, but whether or not they stand up in court is a different matter. So let's just simply get right into it. There are two core areas to this lawsuit that Strava is upset about. The very first one, number one, is heat maps. They're upset at Garmin's generation of heat maps. We'll talk about that in just a second. And the second one being they're upset about Garmin's use of Garmin segments. To which you're like, Garmin has Garmin segments? No, I didn't say Strava segments. I said Garmin segments. They're upset about Garmin segments, something that came out in 2014 or so. And Strava is now upset about that. And we'll get into why in just a second. So we're going to start off with a heat map one because honestly, that's the most clear-cut one. And you'll see why in just a second here. So first thing to understand is Strava's patents around heat maps. This patent was filed in December of 2014. So these dates are super important here, right? December 2014. And it basically talks about how you can have user collected data. So that means your activities, and then it compiles them together, and you can create a heat map based on that. They then had that patent issued in 2016. Meaning you applied for it in 2014, and they got granted in 2016 through the US Patent and Trademark Office. That process involves an examiner looking at your application, and then going out and do some research and deciding whether or not your application is valid. Just because an examiner approves your application doesn't mean it can't be overturned later on. Something that Wahoo learned the hard way when they sued Zwift and the judge came back and said, we're gonna no on this. In any case, the patent of course is very, very long, but the key intro paragraph is down below in case you want to read it on what defines a heat map in technical terms. And then from there, Strava is upset that Garmin has included this technology in Garmin Connect as well as their devices. And you can see this old block of text right there as well, talking about all those watches. Except here's the funny thing that revisionist history often forgets. Garmin actually had heat maps before Strava did. They had them like 6 or 8 months before Strava did. Strava had segments first. We'll get into segments in just a second. But when it comes to heat maps, Garmin rolled out heat maps for select US cities in March of 2013. And in fact, Garmin even had the ability to toggle on and off these heat map layers as well. So this is 18 months before Strava even filed their patent for it. March of 2013. In June of 2013, there was a site here called RaceShape that you can go onto, and you could basically create your own heat map using the underlying Strava activity data. Third-party site, totally free, super cool thing. I wrote a piece about it, yes, 12 years ago about this. I'll put a link down at the bottom there about that. In fact, even the New York Times had a heat map website for cycling data. I kid you not, this thing is still live. I'll put that link down there at the bottom too. Then in September 2013, so now we're talking about 6 or so months after Garmin, Strava announced their own personal heat maps. That's where you could see your own personal data, but you couldn't see other data yet, and you couldn't route on it. This was just simply like heat maps to see heat maps. Back in these days, there was no Strava route builder or anything like that. This was just simply looking at where other cyclists were doing things. Then nearly a year later, at the end of the year, on December 2014, Strava finally got around to filing their patent for heat maps. And this ignores the rest of the industry doing industry things, right? Back in those days, map by ride, map by run, map by dog, map by everything was a huge deal with tons and tons of features. Thus, the fact that Strava even got a patent for this is mind-boggling. But as any patent lawyer will tell you, and I've covered this many, many times, getting a patent is relatively easy in the grand scheme of things. Defending that patent, that's what matters. And that's going to be incredibly difficult here for Strava to defend that patent. And especially doing so a decade later when every other company on the planet has some sort of heat map type technology. And now Strava is trying to go out and starting to sue some of those companies. So then let's get to the second piece, which is the Strava segments piece. Now, Strava, I think everyone agrees, Strava was the first one with Strava segments. Strava was introduced to the world in 2009, and segments were available for users to create back then in 2009. However, oddly, they didn't file a patent for that until 2011. Typically speaking, the US Patent and Trademark Office gives you about a year grace period in a best case scenario to file a patent after public disclosure. This goes well beyond that. So it's sort of interesting they still got the patent anyways, but again, back to the previous one, getting a patent is easy, defending it is difficult. So then we fast forward a couple years until 2014, and Garmin is announcing the Garmin Edge 1000 in June of 2014. With that, they also announced Garmin segments. This was basically a copy of Strava segments. You can go onto Garmin Connect, you could build a segment, you had leaderboards there, it was all within the Garmin stack. At the time with the Edge 1000, they announced it was available on that as well, and then later on over the course of the year, it became available on most other Garmin Edge devices, as well as eventually running devices and so on. And I know it's hard to imagine, but a decade ago, the idea of live segments on your device did not exist at all, nor did it exist for any sort of API to be able to pull those segments back and forth to manufacturers to be able to put in your devices. So the problem here is that no one really cared. No one really wanted Garmin segments. They didn't want to create these segments everywhere. Now, of course, some people did, but most people did not care. They wanted Strava segments. And Strava and Garmin heard that. As two companies that had worked relatively closely together until this point in time, they started working on Strava live segments on Garmin devices. And in April of 2015, they signed what was called the Master Cooperation Agreement, the MCA. Another really important date and term to remember. The MCA had a whole bunch of terms and conditions with it, and unfortunately, they have not yet included the MCA in the legal documents filed. I suspect eventually they will. Whether or not they mark that as confidential remains to be seen. I hope not, because that's going to be fascinating. There's apparently carve-outs there for fees. There's carve-outs there for all sorts of interesting things. Strava is saying that as part of that agreement, Garmin was supposed to basically like simmer down on the Garmin segments thing. And Garmin kind of did. Basically, there was no meaningful development, really any development at all about Garmin segments since then. They put it on subsequent devices, and if you have a new Garmin device today, you can use Garmin segments or Strava segments, but that feature hasn't been updated in a decade, basically, and no one cares or really uses it. So then on July 7th, 2015, Garmin announced Strava Live segments where you could do Strava segments on your Garmin device. That feature hasn't really changed much in a decade. It's still the same as it was back then. There's plenty of things Garmin to do to make that better, but yeah, it is what it is. Which is strange then, that here we are a decade after that, well, a decade and 3 months after that, and now Strava is upset. And the kicker here is that Strava noted in the lawsuit that Garmin's segment implementation basically floundered and failed. And I think everyone, even Garmin themselves, would agree with that, but they just sort of left it there and no one's really cared until now. And now before we get to what Strava wants out of this, I sent a note over to Strava being like, interesting, you filed a lawsuit. Do you have any official comment? And they gave this little snippet down below. They said that Garmin received limited permission from Strava to implement Strava segments on their devices. However, they then leveraged this access to carefully study those features, painstakingly copy them, and then release them as Garmin features. Garmin rejected Strava's repeated attempts to address this infringement informally, forcing Strava to take a stand on the matter and file a suit to protect its patent innovations. We'll set aside the fact that Garmin actually implemented Garmin segments on the devices before Strava Live segments, but maybe Strava is saying that they updated some of the algorithm stuff and tweaked things after the Strava Live segments. But either way, that doesn't explain why they would wait 10 years to be upset about that. So I went back to Strava and asked that as well. And they said, well, we can't provide additional comment on the suit at this time. We encourage you to read the complaint. Oh, I've read it. Which provides a full background of Garmin's actions and infringement. Regarding timing, we reached out to Garmin repeatedly over a period of several months to resolve this amicably and were rejected. Garmin has been increasingly aggressive to its partners lately, perhaps due to competitive pressure, and Strava is standing up for the hard work our teams have put into building unique features. Did they actually say increasingly aggressive to partners lately? Strava said that? Like, they know they're talking about, wait, what? Strava's the one that literally last year caused Trailforks to delete 60 million activities from their database in order to comply with their API. 60 million activities. They also basically caused a bunch of other third-party platforms to shut down, and now Strava is increasingly aggressive to their partners. I could see if you said Garmin was increasingly aggressive to its consumers through its pricing policies and maybe Connect Plus and whatever else, but to its partners, that's a bit of a stretch. But is it? So let's talk about what Garmin's doing that's upsetting their partners, because this part is where it gets like bonkers crazy. Don't worry, we're gonna get to what Strava wants in just a second here. So about a year ago, when Strava had its big 2024 API fiasco and told a bunch of their partners they had to do all these terms to agree with the API and do it in 30 days, one of the things that was in that is around AI training. In particular, how these third-party companies could use data in the Strava database for training AI. But Garmin wasn't super happy about that, because from a Garmin perspective, this data came from your Garmin watch, Garmin device, whatever, was then synced to Strava and then off to third-party companies. It wasn't Strava's data to dictate the terms on. All this just seemed like a bit of a double standard to Garmin. They were kind of annoyed about it. Likewise, there were some new attribution requirements, basically as to how you display Strava data. And Garmin wasn't happy about that either, because basically this data originated from Garmin, went through Strava to third parties, and Garmin was basically being like cut out of the middle of this whole thing from an attribution perspective. Attribution basically is like the bottom of Google Maps when you see this map was from X provider. That's attribution. So over the course of the spring and the winter, Garmin started working on a new policy around attribution. Basically, this policy said that if you're using Garmin data via the API, so if you sync it from Garmin Connect to a third-party platform, you have to somewhere on that data page show that it came from Garmin. Again, just like Google and countless other providers out there. Except Strava was not very happy about this at all. Garmin had shown this to a bunch of partners earlier on, and most of them were kind of like, whatever, sure, no big deal. But Strava didn't like this any way, shape, or form. So when Garmin announced this policy as the public policy going forward in July, that's when the ball got rolling. Now, Garmin had told partners they had until basically the end of the year, so like 6 months to get this done, compared to the 30 days that Strava had in the past for massive changes. Garmin also told their partners, if you're having a problem with the timeline, just let us know and we'll figure it out together, not a big deal. But it was a big deal to Strava. And as a result, that's what triggered off some of the notifications we saw around both segments and heat maps. The other thing that probably tickled Strava a little bit around heat maps was Garmin's announcement of the Trails feature as part of Connect Plus back in May. That allowed you to basically see routes that were nearby. Didn't actually have anything to do with heat maps in the grand scheme of things. It was basically creating routes on Garmin Connect based on various filters. From Strava's standpoint, that was potentially taking customers away that would have paid for those features on Strava instead. So what's Strava requesting? Well, here's the exact wording here. Strava is therefore entitled to a permanent injunction prohibiting defendants, Garmin, from making, using, offering to sell, selling, or importing the accused implementations in any color variations of the patented technology. But it goes on. Monetary relief alone is inadequate. Garmin's continued infringement of the 922 patent causes irreparable harm to Strava, including loss of network effects, erosion of platform differentiation and goodwill, and brand loyalty that cannot be fully measured or compensated in money. And then from there, they just blah, blah, blah a bunch and basically say that Garmin should take all their devices off the market with this offending technology, which is essentially all of their watches and bike computers. So at that point, I was like, well, what's going to happen to users? Obviously, if Strava is demanding that these Garmin devices be taken off the market, including all the Strava technology that they're supposedly infringing upon in that, that's going to affect users. That would include things like activity sync from your Garmin device to Strava as a platform to be able to see your activity after the fact. That includes route sync, going from Strava routes back into Garmin. That includes Strava segment sync. That includes a gazillion of the little features that go back and forth there that could be impacted. So I emailed both companies as to what to expect. I have not received a response back from Garmin. It's been about 18 hours right now. I have received a response back from Strava. So Strava actually did respond to my request for comment, and they said, our lawsuit is between two companies. We do not intend to take any actions that would disrupt the ability of Garmin users to sync their data with Strava and hope Garmin values our shared users in the same way. That's an interesting approach because you're literally telling Garmin to take these devices off the market. But, that setting aside, the thing is, I'm betting that Strava is betting that Garmin won't retaliate, because Garmin's MO on this sort of thing is to do it all quietly behind the scenes in court. In fact, Garmin's MO, even more importantly, is to win in court. Garmin wins the vast, overwhelming majority of the patent cases that companies file against Garmin. In fact, they almost never lose a case. The last case that I can see they lost was over 15 years ago, and only a handful of other quiet minor settlements in various Garmin departments like boating and all sorts of stuff like that since then. Again, Garmin's MO here, Garmin's corporate thing here is not to rock the boat, at least in public view. So that then gets to why. Why is Strava bothering to do this? Well, the thing to keep in mind is Strava is in the final stages of planning an IPO right now. It's been widely rumored. They've been courting investment banks to go ahead and launch that IPO, so basically becoming a public company onto the stock market. And this could potentially raise their profile a little bit in that realm, give them some more publicity that maybe would raise some more money. The problem is that's a super risky move. Keeping in mind that Garmin and Strava were the two closest partners for the longest time, because Garmin's users make the majority of the paid Strava user base. Thus, upsetting that apple cart wouldn't be super ideal. Likewise, on the flip side, Strava has never been super close to Apple, though they have seemingly tried to court more favors in that relationship in the last year. But again, the bulk of the third-party source paying users from Strava are coming from Garmin. But the challenge I have with all of this is that over the coming months, as Strava prepares their IPO, they're going to be sitting down in a room with a bunch of people, and those people are very smart people and be looking at business things. And they're going to sit here and look at this lawsuit and go, Why are you doing that? Why are you poking the 800-pound gorilla for no obvious reason, the one that has the biggest source of revenue into your company, and doing so on the case of one patent that you're almost certainly going to get dismissed, and in the case of the segment side of things, something that is almost a decade old with virtually no usage on the Garmin side. There's just no upside here for Strava whatsoever in trying to stir this nest of bees other than getting stung themselves. I've talked to a bunch of really close people in the last 24 hours about this, and everyone is just completely befuddled as to why Strava would poke this bear. In any case, on the bright side, it's going to give us a whole lot of fun legal documents over the next months or years to look through because all sorts of fun stuff comes out in the discovery process that eventually ends up online to look at. So with that, definitely hit subscribe for plenty more sports tech goodness. There's plenty more products to come, and I'm guessing a bit more Strava drama as well. With that, have a good one.